Arshi, over to you.
So, hello everyone, good evening and good day. I'm Arshi Rizvi, co-leader of Evaluate India and member of the Promoting National Evaluation Policy theme of APEA. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the seventh webinar of this year, APEA webinar series. Today we bring to you a conversation that is both timely and highly relevant to the evolving global development landscape. So this year we have seen major shifts in the global development landscape, especially with key donor countries reducing foreign aid. This has led to changes in how other funding agencies operate and is also affecting many multilateral organizations, including different UN agencies. So while these cuts mainly target program cost, they are also having an impact on monitoring and evaluation functions. At APEA, through our theme on promoting national evaluation policies and systems, we are working to strengthen evaluation system in the region. But we also recognize that many countries still rely heavily on donor support for their evaluation efforts. MNE has always played a key role in international aid, helping ensure accountability and supporting evidence based decisions. But with the shrinking aid budgets, these important systems for learning and accountability are at risk. Thus, to understand what is happening at the global level and how it affects the various stakeholders, API is hosting this webinar. Its seats was sown earlier this year during a P2P session by Evaluate Asia, where this point was raised that it will be a good to understand how aid cuts are affecting evaluation. Thus, on the demand of YE's participants, we bring to you two perfect people to speak about the issue. So today, in response to that demand, we are glad to present two speakers who are ideally placed to speak on this issue. Our moderator today, Mohib Iqbal, an active member of Australian Evaluation Society, the Afghan Evaluation Society, and the volunteer team leader of NEPS at APEA, where he collaborates with peers to further refine best practices in evaluation. With that, I will hand it over to Iqbal to introduce our speakers and guide today's session. Once again, a very warm welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us. Over to you, Iqbal.
Thank you, Arshi, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining us. We are still getting some people joining. We have quite a large registration for this topic. My name is Mohib Iqbal, as Arshi said as well. I'm a member of a number of the evaluation organization that Arshi talked to. I'm an economist by training, and I have been doing evaluation for over a decade and a half. And now I also work with these global bodies to advance the practice of evaluation. Today's event is about the changing aid budgets globally. The Trump administration this year carried out one of the largest restructuring of foreign aid in history, with 83% of USAID budget and programs have been canceled. And the rest of the funds have now shifted from USAID to the Foreign Office. In addition, United Kingdom has announced a $6 billion pound cut to its $15 billion pound budget, which is almost half of the sort of the aid budget that UK put into international development. That's broader discussion on the aid cuts. How has this affected the evaluation? There has been a 97% cut to the evaluation budget, which the USAID allocated to evaluation programs in their budget. And that comes to around $34 million. But That said, the budget cut to evaluation is even more significant when we take into account the budget that was allocated to evaluation as part of programs that were cut. So there is a very large cut to international development evaluation in that sense. As Archie sort of said, we have two very distinguished speakers, Marie Gardner. Um, and Winston Allen. Marie is an executive director of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, famously known as 3IE. Um, she has been leading 3IE since 2020, and prior to that, she has worked with the World Bank Independent Evaluation Office. Winston Allen is an international development program evaluator. He has worked with USAID evaluation. He holds a PhD in international development from University of Pennsylvania. He has a very close knowledge of the changes in the US context, so we will get to that discussion pretty soon. Winston, to start with the conversation, can you share with us how the cuts are affecting the evaluation landscape in the US and really what has changed? Winston, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mohib, and can you hear me?
We can
Yeah.
hear you, yes.
And I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this webinar and to share my thoughts. Before reflecting on how the cuts have affected the evaluation landscape in the US, I will provide some context. Well, first of all, USAID was, during its existence, was one of the first federal agencies to publish an evaluation policy. And this was in 2011 that the evaluation policy was published. And since that time, when the agency, up to when the agency was dismantled, over 2,250 program evaluations were commissioned by the agency. And this included performance evaluations of activities with a budget of 20 million or more, as well as impact evaluations of activities that are being piloted. However, a key element of the policy is that required evaluations were to be conducted by external evaluators. So when we talk of the impact on the evaluation landscape, the initial effect and what I will consider the most direct effect on the evaluation landscape was on these external evaluators. The cuts resulted in an immediate and significant reduction in the demand for evaluation services. And these included effect on small businesses. Since the policy was established, there had been a lot of small businesses which were developed to provide evaluation services, as well as large businesses. And many of them, since I'll say around February when the cuts came into effect, have laid off workers, and some may have gone out of business. But this is an area which I think we still need to investigate to really get a sense of how this reduction in demand has affected these providers of evaluation services. Also, most of these US-based evaluation firms were operating in partnership with local firms and evaluation experts in the countries where USAID worked. So there is also a ripple effect in these countries with many of these local firms. Some of them were think tanks, evaluation consultancies, and individuals who were participating in evaluation teams who no longer have access to opportunities to practice their evaluation expertise. So I think generally speaking, it may take a few months and some additional analysis to get a sense of the real impact of these on these suppliers of evaluations and how what type of strategies they are using to address the impacts. I know some of them are now trying to have joint partnerships and so on. But I think there's opportunity to really learn a little more about how this has impacted the suppliers. So that's where I'll stop for now, and I'll hand it over to you again, Moin.
Thanks, Winston. That's a very good start. I think that the effect on especially the U.S. Businesses, while and of course the non-for-profit sector broadly are pretty widespread, and we have heard from friends and from colleagues who have we worked with on projects and collaborated with over the years. So thanks for sharing that. Marie, to sort of come to you, your organization provides a very broad evidence base for development practice on many, many topics, and there's quite an amazing work that 3IE does. What I wanted to know is how this has affected development sector and evaluation landscape from your perspective.
Yes, thanks, Mohib, and also thanks, Arshi, for the nice introduction, and thanks for the invitation from APEA, and good day to all of you fellow colleagues and evaluators out there. You alluded to this a bit already, Mohib, and also Winston, but the shrinking aid budgets is obviously part of a broader phenomenon. And a very worrying, I must add. So higher defense spending and sort of a rise of inward-looking populist governments in other major donor countries has also, been to the detriment of aid, and including places in places like the UK, you mentioned, Mohib, but there's also in Germany, France, Belgium, Holland, Sweden, and the funding of to UN organizations has also been severely affected, not just by cuts, but also by actually unpaid dues. So I recently found out that United States is the largest debtor at about $1.5 billion, but with other major contributors with unpaid dues, including China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and Venezuela. So really quite dire situation. And the decrease in aid and development spending is having really devastating effects on lives across the world, and most importantly, really on those marginalized populations who depended on these programs. So we've all heard the news from refugee aid in Mozambique, in Myanmar, to maternal health services in Afghanistan, etc. Critical programs are on the brink or collapse, or are collapsing, and life-saving operations worldwide are also threatened. And in addition, as was also mentioned, many people who were involved in implementing life-saving programs or in implementing evidence-producing programs have lost their jobs. And I'm sure there may be colleagues with us here today that have experienced or know people. So some countries are continuing with robust spending, such as, in fact, my own country, Norway. But it's a small country. Countries like Japan and Korea and institutions like the ADB, but the overall trend is really down. And nevertheless, who is impacted most and how is obviously still complicated. Australia's DFED, for example, as I've learned, has increased its focus even more on the Asia-Pacific region in response to the cuts. So it's a really varied picture. And one thing I wanted to just step back for a second to talk about is the title of the session, which also refers to global aid in transition. So to me, at least, while the US aid cuts have probably that was probably the biggest shock to the aid system in modern history of the aid history. It is, in my view, also only one element of what I'm sort of referring to as the perfect storm that is hitting the development and evaluation community. So in addition to these shrinking aid budgets, we are also affected by erosion of shared values. We are affected by disinformation storm, and also to a certain extent, the tendency of dismantling of democratic institutions. So I think we'll be seeing less international and cross-border solidarity, and sort of a pressure towards more self-reliance. Now I hope, or a hope rather, although I'm not so sure it's realistic, is that the cuts in aid will unveil to certain populations the poor performance of their governments, and that in turn will lead to an increased demand for accountability, transparency, and services. And we've seen some strong voices expressing this view coming, for example, out of Africa. However, for some countries, aid dependency is real, and it's not a fault of bad policies. And I think that needs to be really recognized. Now, the dramatic cuts in aid and also the other elements of this perfect storm are also affecting, obviously, the evaluation community, as we're talking about here. I think the immediate effects are, of course, that many of us have lost projects we were engaged in and productive learning partnerships, as well as pipelines of future work. So to give you an example, we in 3IE were very much affected. We had finally, we're starting to also work with USAID. We had sort of diversified our portfolio. We were working with MCC, etc. And these were lost at the beginning of the year. But I hear of organizations that have been hit much harder than ours, and have had to close or let many staff go, etc. So this is really a tough one. A secondary effect is that when organizations close, there's a chance that knowledge and evidence is lost. And the know-how of the people that work there, and also the products that were produced and shared, like we saw when suddenly all the USAID publications were gone. This is a real threat. And I'm also worried that the good recruitment that we've seen in recent years to the evaluation field, like I'm sure you've seen the recruitment into APEA, etc. If this is lost because there's less funding, then it'll take very long to build up again. So that's a worry. And then beyond that, another effect of the cuts is, I think, a more inward-looking focus. It is around the evaluations that are funded. The scope may become narrower, more self-serving. So that's, and I'll hopefully come back to that later in today. But I'm worried about also the scope and the focus of evaluations. And then the final area of concern is that the cuts of and the erosion of sort of democratic institutions may also mean that independent evaluation functions and audit functions in governments, etc., may be under threat, both in international organizations and in governments. We all know that democracy is sort of upheld by the mindsets of people and by institutions with strong self-correcting mechanisms. We often talk about the media, the independent judiciary, but I also think evaluation is a very strong part of that, and I wouldn't take those independent evaluation functions for granted. And then so just to finalize here on a more hopeful note, I guess, is that there is still demand for what the evaluation community has to offer. And even though budgets sort of may be smaller and money is still being spent by public entities, money is rather spent by public entities, both donors and governments, and no one really stands, behind wasting money, and that means that there will still be demand for accountability and for learning how to get more out of each dollar, and that of course requires knowing what works, what does not, and for whom. And that's where organizations like 3IE thrive to exist. I'm hopefully coming back to that later. So back over to you, Mohib.
Thanks, Mary. I think you picked up some really, really important points. I think one of the takeaways from your conversation, if I'm correct, is that we're still learning the impacts and the direction of the impacts from this. We know the cuts are very heavy. This is a huge storm that is coming in the development sector and for the evaluation, capacity globally and in the United States. However, I think, you mentioned whether this means there is domestic demand in different countries and regions by citizens from their governments to improve their accountability and to improve their performance. Well, if that effect happens, that could be a positive that comes out of this situation. But at the same time, we are losing institutions, we are losing knowledge, we are losing individuals who have worked for a long time, and I think that's pretty strong messages to come out. Winston, I think one of the things that becomes very important in this kind of situation is aid effectiveness, because I think Marie pointed to it, is that the importance of the aid budget, smaller aid budgets, we need to get the most of each dollar invested in that. With a shrinking capacity in the evaluation, and you pointed to small and large businesses going down and evaluation field and colleagues leaving the field and sector or refocusing on some other things domestically in the US or other places. What do you think how would this affect the aid effectiveness globally and in the US?
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that's a very good question. Now, USA doesn't exist anymore, right? But programmatically, when it did exist, it was investing at least 1% of its program budgets on evaluation, including evaluation or technical assistance, as well as evaluation capacity building. So as far as foreign assistance evaluations are concerned in the US, there are two legislations which are still in the books. And these are the Foreign Aid Transparency and Accountability Act of 2016 and the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018, which is popularly known as the Evidence Act. And both of these acts actually require federal agencies to collect and use evidence in policy and programmatic decision making. So, in effect, agencies that are still funding foreign assistance programs will still need to be conducting evaluations in the US. So having said that, I would say going forward, it is hard to say how the courts will affect evaluation capacity. Of course, there's going to be maybe more consolidation of the survivors, in terms of the suppliers of evaluations and, maybe limited diversity. But it's an area that I think will unfold as we go forward to see the effect on the capacity itself. Globally, I think there's a likelihood that there will be less evaluations conducted because, as already mentioned, there may be fewer programs, which will mean less demand for external evaluations. However, I think it is not so much looking at it, not so much the quantity of the evaluations that is important, but really the quality of the evaluations. And so I'm thinking, I think Marie alluded to this a little bit, because of the funding situation, there could be a trend and increased interest to rigorously demonstrate the effectiveness of the limited development assistance programs that are being funded. So I also think that there may that is looking at it positively. There may likely be an increased focus on evaluating for sustainability, because one of the arguments that being made in terms of these cuts, especially on the USAID side, is that it has been in existence for 60 years and there's nothing to show for it. So it seems going forward, really understanding the sustainability from the donor side, I can imagine they'll be interested in determining the extent to which the limited dollar that is being invested is the activities or whatever the outcomes or what is being addressed is sustainable in the long run. Also, with the possible reduction of the evaluation suppliers in donor countries, there could be an increased participation of local institutions. I think one of the areas we were focusing just before the agency was dismantled was really how do we build the capacity of local institutions and, get into really getting the localization elements of evidence up and running. And this will include think tanks, universities, evidence networks, etc. They are more likely to be engaged, in these foreign assistant evaluations, which also means, for example, that some of the evaluation questions may be driven by local interest, because I think a lot of, you look at the evaluations as they are now, a lot of the questions are coming from the donor side. I mean, really understanding what's going on with their funding or the results of the activities. But I think I'm being optimistic, as we mentioned, there might be a little more interest since we're looking at self-reliance, sustainability, that questions may be driven by local interest in terms of the development process of these limited funds that are coming in, which I think is a good thing because it also speaks to the sustainability of the knowledge, because Maya was mentioning knowledge is being lost, so that if knowledge is generated based on the interest and the questions that either civil societies, organizations like APEA, AFRIA, other evidence and networks are participating in these evaluations, then I think applying the findings or the evidence will have a greater, possibility because of the local participation. Because I think sometimes the evidence is generated, but then it moves on, and in the countries, the activities, it's not applied in the country or it's published. But then if there's a way that through the local participation, we have things like the evidence networks using evidence and then linking even the governments where there's the enabling environment for them to participate, then they could translate some of those evidence into policy. And so down the road, we might be able to begin to get a little more sustainable outcomes of these activities, and also maybe a little more emphasis on understanding the ex post evaluations, because one of the things that I think was a gap in our, at least from the USAID side, was a lot of the evaluations were current. Just you look at the activity end, and because the evaluations were tied to the program funds, when the program ends, you don't know what really happened down the road. And it was only just about a year or two before then we were beginning to get some funds to look at some ex post evaluations of activities which had ended a few years and see whether they were sustained, whether the systems were sustained. So I think just getting that will help to alleviate some of the fears, because I think from the donor side, folks that say, oh, this is all money that is being thrown down the drain or going down a black hole. But if we're able to begin to demonstrate the sustainability, or at least plan the programs and then evaluate how sustainable they are down the road, I think that would be a good, outcome, use in this situation to make more positive outcomes in terms of development. So I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Winston. Just to our audience, thank you for staying with us. Just if you have questions, please share it in the chat, and we will be in another round. We'll be picking some question from the chat as well. Marie, I wanted to come to you from your vantage point. I think what I'm hearing from both of you is, that there could be positive sides to this. And one of the things that I'm thinking about, there's always have been a perception about aid that it doesn't work, it doesn't produce the intended outcomes, it doesn't cause the societal change that usually is hypothesized about these things. So in that lens and in that sort of sphere of thinking, what I wanted to sort of know from your perspective, would this cuts to aid further affect and sort of strengthen those perception that, given there will be no evidence, or sort of there will be a lack of evidence coming through, would there be an impact on that side of that type of perceptions? And if so, what can evaluators do? What can agencies like 3IE do about that? Marie, that was to you.
Yeah, sorry, I was just unmuting. So if I may, I want to sort of first address, because I think we'll come back to the solutions a bit in the last part. So if I can keep those, because I want to, I was actually, I was quite excited to hear from Winston about his positive perceptions. I guess he got out of the bed today on the right foot, and I had the exact same, some of the same arguments, but I guess my glass was a bit more, for the sake of argument and just for all of us to see a different perspective. I see, I see it slightly more gloomy. So I think, for example, just to start off on the effect of the cuts, and particularly also around thinking particularly also about the Asia Pacific region. But first of all, generally, when there's less funding to aid and development, I think the funding for evaluation and evidence may be cut disproportionately. So a bit back to your point, Mohib, I don't think that sort of, even though there is now a large body of evidence, 3IE has our development evidence portal with more than 20,000 studies, impact evaluations, gap maps, systematic reviews, like a treasure trove where you can find out things that work, things that don't work, etc. That's all there. I don't think currently, decision makers, policy makers, and even evaluators are actually sufficiently using that knowledge. And so I think that I think when there is a battle around funding, I think that and I'm worried that evaluation and evidence is going to see as a sort of it would have been nice to have when you have a better times, but now it's we don't have time for this, more or less. I think it's not sufficiently a culture of using evidence and critical thinking is not sufficiently there yet, neither in the international development organizations nor in government. I think we're working, and 3IE we're working with a number of organizations, for example, in what we call the Global Evidence Commitment, to really sort of find out how do you strengthen the use of evidence in places like FCDO, in NORAD, in the Inter-American Development Bank, etc. How do you get to, looking at incentives in these organizations, at resources, at the signals sent from management and leadership, etc. To really so there is a lot of things we can do, but I am still worried that we're not yet sufficiently there to be sort of protected from these serious cuts. And so I think in the Asia Pacific region, for example, I think there's a huge diversity of countries. They're ranging from fragile contexts like Myanmar, Papua New Guinea, to middle-income economies, Indonesia and Vietnam, for example. And we, to do the best thing, to be effective in the use of aid, it requires also context-specific evidence. It's good to learn from generalized evidence, but you also need to understand what works in specific context. And there is very much insufficient context-specific evidence in this region. There's also, I think, there's a concern that fragile and marginalized populations may be disproportionately affected. Typically, when when there's cuts to aid and cuts to funding, fragile states and vulnerable groups are often last in line when aid shrinks. And these are the contexts we know the least about what works. So it's the most important, and we know the least. And that's kind of what we find across also our evidence gap maps and our systematic reviews. I think the second effect I worry about is a bit sort of opposite. I hope Winston is correct that the little money we have we'll use well to do nice, large mixed method, long-term evaluations, etc. But I worry that evaluation practice may shift to shorter-term, donor-driven exercises with less funding for mixed methods, impact evaluations that also take into consideration long-term effects, unintended effects, subgroup effects, cost analysis, which I know Winston has been part of, was part of bringing to USAID. So, all these good practices, I worry will be suffering. In other words, that donor preferences may shift towards low-cost, fast turnaround studies, and marginalizing, complex methods like RCTs or mixed methods evaluations that are, important for systematic, more generalizable insights. And then the third effect that I'm worried about, or, it's kind of interesting on the one hand, but even it's not only the cuts, but it's also where are they going, and the new funders, where are they coming? What type of sectors are they supporting? And so I think, so for example, there's a recent rebound, I understand, in Chinese spending in the Asia Pacific, and with that, a renewed interest in large-scale infrastructure projects. And so I think, and more generally, I hear from my team that infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and climate change, these are sort of topics we see in all the RFPs we see coming out in the region, and that they may get more attention, while the US aid cuts could result in more limited focus on issues like democracy and governance, education, and gender in Asia. And so what's interesting, though, is that new evaluations, you can only evaluate programs and policies that are actually getting implemented, right? And so that sort of restricts our new learning, what is being done. And so there will, on the one hand, then be opportunities for to gather, for example, to gather more evidence in how to do best practice infrastructure projects. But if there are less programs in the areas, say, of governance, etc., there will also be less maybe opportunities to evaluate and learn how to build good governance effectively in the region. But as I mentioned, again, there's a huge opportunity to bring out and use existing evidence that is available in a number of databases, including, as I mentioned, 3IE's development evidence portal, but also UN has databases, the OECD DAC has databases bringing together good evaluations that have been done. Then, finally, I'd like to mention that this changing evidence landscape presents also an opportunity for regional actors, sort of governments, think tanks, and local evaluators to take greater ownership. And Winston talked about that as well, the ownership of the evaluation agenda. And I think regional network can advocate for sustainable funding, broker South-South partnerships, support national evaluation systems, etc. I think all of that is quite promising. However, I have a concern that cuts reduce sort of the technical assistance and capacity development initiatives that have been in place to support governments, and support the networks in the region. And so, is it too soon? Emerging evaluation communities may lose the mentorship and partnership opportunities, with global evaluators and donors, and question back to the community, are we quite there? Is it ready for that? And I'm worried that that the practice is not yet quite where it needs to be self-sustained. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Perry, for that. I think we are getting some questions from the audience as well, and I will encourage audience, if you have questions, please post it there. We have some questions coming in, and I might combine them with my final questions. Winston, we have already sort of started looking ahead. In sense that we are in a situation that we know the significance and the scale of it, but the effect of it is yet to emerge. It could go as positive as we sort of discussed, and I think some of the discussion that Marie brought to this conversation, I think is very important that this will, the more marginalized, the more less understood sort of side of the evaluation might get affected. There might be more sort of short, low cost, more sort of proven methods used, and some of the participatory methods might be sort of shelved for a while. And we also don't know about the agenda of the newcomers in the aid sector, because there's also suggestions that large philanthropic organizations might start to fill the gap that has come to existence. So in sort of that broader context, looking ahead, what does future hold for evaluation? How do you see the future can evolve?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And I think some of what Maria had said I actually recognize. I think, evaluation itself, I would say I've been in the business for a while. At the time, I started at a time where evaluation was like even in a project or program document is maybe one paragraph at the end. And to where we are today, I would say it's basically kind of a mainstream activity in development. And you have organizations like 3IE, and there's been a lot of strides in randomized controlled trials and production of evidence, like Marisa alluding to, in terms of what works. But I think the challenge we have is, how do we translate what works into action? And I think there's still some divide between the design of the activities that are being implemented and the evaluators that are eventually going to be evaluating these activities. And I think, knowing what works, I always say the RCT is almost like it is what it is, that it's a randomized control trial, and it's, kind of with the evidence that, measure and determine causality. And if you know what works, then why don't you use it? And so where's the gap that makes us not use what works? And I think as the funding continue to shrink, because I don't know if it's if it's going to get back to where it was, or it will continue to shrink or remain stable, it means for me really being very strategic and efficient, uh, especially where you have a toolbox now of these are the things that work in nutrition, in education. Now, how do we translate that into action and tweak it? Just like you go to the doctor, they'll give you the malaria medicine, but based on your context, you might tweak it this way or that way. So I think that's very important going forward. And I think looking ahead, I think the future of development assistance will, in my view, will be locally driven, because the message that's coming out, especially even in the US, if you look at the statement that's been made so far in this new wave, is how do we get local governments, the self-sufficiency to lead the effort. And I think that increasingly local institutions will be leading evaluations, including translating the evaluations evidence into action, with an emphasis on sustainability. Because I think some things might work, for example, but then how sustainable will it be? Because it might work, but maybe now the systems to really make it work are not in place. So that your intervention may not necessarily be the outcome itself, but how do we get that outcome by tweaking the systems themselves. So, and some of those now will involve having local participation, local actors to really help in the process. And I think also going forward, there's also been this discussion about partnerships. To what we hear a lot of about partnership between North and South, but to what extent are these partnerships true partnerships? Between the evaluators, because sometimes you'll be a partner, but because the funding is coming from the north, it's almost like a donor recipient still. But I think knowledge is something which even if you don't have the money, but you have the knowledge at the local level, that itself is a value, because it's worth more than a lot of money if you know exactly what the context is, and you can help to translate that money into actual positive outcomes to help to improve the development context. So overall, I think, just ending on a positive note, that as we move into the future, we should continue to strengthen capacity and creating opportunities for ownership of evaluation at the process at the country level. I know money is needed, but I think there's a lot of capacity building sometimes, which is learning from each other, not so much, the money. But of course, money will be important. But I think creating strengthening the capacity at the local level and providing local ownership for evaluations will help in terms of advancing some of the evidence that we are trying to translate into action, and as well as creating an enabling environment that will encourage and establish incentives for evaluation. And I think that's one of the role I'll see organizations like APEA, AFRIA, the different local voluntary organization of professional evaluators playing in terms of advocacy. How do we collaborate with different think tanks and brokers of knowledge in these countries to really make evaluation become, I don't know if Barry was saying something, but become more of a part of the culture of doing business, of making decisions. And so in a way that we can nurture local leadership and building knowledge in the evaluation field, as well as building capacity for individuals to develop their skills. So I think we should not stop. I think everything is going to come together at some point. But I think, to me, the future is at the local level in terms of really translating the evaluation findings into action, and hopefully begin to demonstrate to those who are funding and investing in the programs that things really do work and the decisions are guided by rigorous evidence. So I'll stop it there.
Thanks, Winston. So another question we have from our audience is, and I'm combining this with sort of a last question that I had as well. Do we think that some of these trends might reverse perhaps after the next US election? I mean, pretty big question, and might get a bit on the speculative end as well. I'll leave it to you if you. And how does the industry prepares for the future? And I think, just picking off the Winston's discussion, APEA is working with parliamentarians, it's working with donors, it's working with the country level professional organizations on a number of fronts, including developing legislative and institutional foundation for evaluation. And that's why we work with the parliamentarians. So I think the question is, I think taking that audience question as well. So is there a reversal? And also, in this context, looking ahead, what can organizations like 3IE, which produces a lot of evidence translation and evidence generation, and organizations like APEA, who works broadly with the political side, institutional side, and the professional side, can do to sort of, reduce the negative impacts that might come from these cuts? Marie, that's to you. Sorry.
Yeah, that's do we have another hour? Okay. No, that's really interesting, and I think so. Just to start with, there is, as I mentioned, a lot of, first of all, just to say, I totally agree with Winston. I think the future is increasingly partnerships and increasingly local and with strengthened ownership, and that's where we need to sort of really focus going forward. I think we are at a different place than we were 15 or even 10 years ago, in the sense that we have all this existing evidence. Let's make sure that what we now have and haven't lost, that we actually keep it safe. And I think a number of us are working to do that and make the most out of it. And I think one of the things, for example, to mention that I'm quite excited about, that we're working with FCDO on, is actually a program where we look at research on evidence-informed policymaking at a very local level. We just, we had an open call. We're now reviewing an amazing amount of high-quality proposals from across the globe to really understand, and research on what it takes for research and evaluations to actually influence policy in very local contexts. And so I think as evaluators, what we can do is always sort of what can we bring from an evaluative perspective to really improve in this regard. And I think the thing that we've done least of, we're good at producing evidence, we are all engaged, but we actually haven't used our own methods to understand that last mile of really how is this going to change anything. That has not been done sufficiently rigorously, and I think that's quite exciting. And then I think so bringing out the current evidence and using it better, make us as evaluators, making sure we use existing evaluation and evidence better. We're actually not very good at it ourselves either. There's a lot of duplication out there, and so that's something, and then sort of finding ways to translate it, make it available at the right time, rapid synthesis, help desks, etc. These things are things we have been learning recently, and so I think my hope is in that regard, that even with less funding, etc., we will be able to. We've come further. There's a history here. We've come further. There's much more evidence. We do it better. We understand a variety of methods better. We don't come in with only one hammer. We realize that for different evaluation questions during a programming cycle, there will be different types of evidence that will need to be brought to bear. So I think that the field has grown up, and that gives me hope. And I think very much more we see real, as Winston mentioned, real collaborations, real partnerships, as opposed to tokenism. There's still some way to go there, but I think that's where we need to see improvements. And then I think there's what really gives me hope is networks like APEA and 3IE working alongside you as well as other organizations. To really make sure that we uphold standards and our values. So we are not, we are a field that we care about equity. We care about how things are affecting the most marginalized. We want to make sure that evaluations uphold those standards. And if we need to also basically ensure that evaluations are, include sufficient stakeholder engagement. If for example, commissioners are not allowing us to share publicly the findings of evaluations, that's something we need to make sure does happen. We need to collect sufficient data to be able to look at marginalized populations. We need to look at costing, not only effectiveness. There's a whole range of things we know need to happen. And I think as a community, we stand much stronger than if we individually, as individual consultants or evaluators, are going to say, no, I'm not going to answer that RFP because it doesn't, it doesn't live up to what it should. I think as a body, as a network, and APEA as an institution can sort of play a role of that sort of, what are certain standards we need to uphold, and if not, we need to sort of, as you mentioned, you have that contact with funders. And similarly, I think, again, bringing our best, understanding of how to strengthen the culture of using evidence into policymaking, and that's something that working with parliamentarians, etc., that you can that I think we can do together. I have a number of other things I want to say, but in view of your last 4 minutes, I'll get back to you.
Thank you, Marie. We are at the very end of our session, and thank you. I think that was a really good discussion. What I would love, I think, would be for us to have a similar discussion 6 months down the line and come back to some of the things we have discussed. So I think, we will keep that on our agenda, and we will. I think it will be very important to do a follow-up conversation on this. In the chat, Carlisle Levin, I think, has said that the Strengthening Evaluation Contractor Partnership is doing a webinar that looks very relevant on, how partnerships can address some of this issue. So I'm sure people can have a look at that. And I think we are taking a group photo now. So I would want anyone who is comfortable to turn on their cameras and give us around 30 to 35 seconds while we take this photo. So please turn on your cameras, and Ahmed, please take photos and over to you when how you want to do that.
Okay, thank you, Mohib. Everyone, please open your camera. We have 3 slides. Okay, for slides 1 and slides 2. And last slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Ahmed. I will now hand it to our colleague Puji, who is a board member of the Mongolian Evaluation Society and a member of the APEA team on this. Puji, over to you for conclusion. Thank you, Marie and Winston, for sharing your great wisdom with us and our audience.
Thank you very much.
Hello everyone. Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you to the speakers and all the participants for such an meaningful and timely discussion today. We have heard powerful reflections on how the changes in global aid are directly impacting our field, the evaluation. So through not just only the losing the jobs or the fewer projects, etc., but also through the loss of learning data and long-term evaluation capacity, etc. So, but there might be many the shifts to be happening in the future with the localization or local ownership, shift in the actors, and the shift in the topics like the climate change, AI, etc. While the areas like democracy, education, etc., may be left behind. Other than despite the concerns, there are also the many new opportunities and approaches are emerging, which could offer fresh opportunities for the evaluation in our field. So in time of the uncertainty, evaluation remains a powerful tool for learning, accountability, and smarter decision-making. So let's keep pushing for more use of evidence and more local leadership and more inclusive approaches from our side. So in the end, let's continue to connect, speak up, and to support each other locally, regionally, and globally. Thank you again very much for being today here and for your continued commitment for the better evolution. Over to you, Mohib.
Thank you. We have a few quick announcements. There is a capacity building training for young and emerging evaluator. You can read the rest. It's on the 13th of August. I think it's online. You can join that. And the APEA's fifth conference is coming up. It's in Tokyo from 11th to 14th of November. We have a really rich program, and we will continue to have the conversation we had today. There is workshops, and then there is a very rich discussion with parliamentarians and with some of the donor institutions, and some of the multilateral organizations are coming and will be participating. So you haven't registered, have a look, register, and we hope to see you there. And there is our social media handles. If you haven't been following Asia Pacific Association, Evaluation Association, you can find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and some of the website, and there is also some emails that you can reach out to us. Thank you very much to the speakers, to the attendees, and to the organizers, people behind this and making this happen. Thank you all.